Greetings and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to talk about the animal life that I found in a couple of hump yards and along the rail lines in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. First, we'll look at Allentown Yard in Allentown, Pennsylvania. It was a hump yard, meaning a classification yard, where a train would get shoved up to the top of a hump and cars would be uncoupled and allowed to roll down the other side into different tracks depending on the destination of the cars. When the cars entered the tracks, they would roll up against or slam into the cars that were already in the tracks, and if the cars contained grain, some of that grain, a little bit of it, would fall on the ground. And that grain attracted pigeons, lots and lots of pigeons. And with the pigeons came hawks, lots and lots of hawks. And the hawks would feast on the pigeons. I've seen hawks grab a pigeon by the wings in midair and fly off with it. I've seen hawks fly at high speed into a pigeon with an explosion of feathers from the pigeon as the hawk knocked the pigeon down to the ground and had its way with it. Really something to see. Then, of course, there were squirrels and other small animals. But at night, those hawks, they did not migrate in the winter. They had plenty to eat all year round, so they stayed right there at Allentown Yard. Then at night, the deer would come out, and there were plenty of deer. And they would wander the yard, and they were not afraid of the railroad employees who were working in the yard, and they were not afraid of the rolling cars that were moving through the yard. I've seen a deer crouch down and run under a rolling tank car. Pretty amazing behavior. The other hump yard I wanted to mention was Oak Island Yard in Newark, New Jersey. But the only animal life I saw in that yard were rats, and a lot of rats. Probably because there were no hawks in Oak Island. And I think that there were no hawks because the Newark International Airport was right next door with flights taking off and landing day and night. I think that scared the hawks off. So there were no pigeons and no hawks in Oak Island Yard, just rats. And in the winter, the retarders that slowed cars down before they entered their tracks, they had heaters in them to keep them from freezing, and the rats loved to hang out underneath the retarders where they could keep warm. And every time a car rolled over the retarders, the rats would run out from underneath the retarders, and then when the car rolled away, the rats would return. In the winter, when there was snow on the ground, that was something to see. Now, along the lines, of course, there were birds, and I had a engineer trainee once, and we'll call him Paul. Whenever I let Paul run the locomotive, this is on through freight trains, birds would smash into the windshield or the front of the locomotive. I mean, it seemed like every time he operated the engine, he would kill at least one bird, sparrows, robins, you name it. I had other engineer trainees that never did that. The birds never struck the engine. When I ran the train, I never hit birds. I called Paul the bird murderer. Hawks love the railroad lines. And I think it's just for the same reason that hawks like highways. It's because the moving vehicles or trains scare up some small critters for the hawks. On the railroads, the hawks would be up on telephone poles, power lines, in the trees, and just watching as the train went by. Or they would fly right alongside the engine at the same speed that we were traveling, and just looking around. I've had hawks fly just above and in front of the engine. Same thing, just looking around, looking for anything that moved. I had a fellow engineer who, at one time at night, an owl flew in the conductor's side window and landed in the middle of the cab on the floor, just standing on the floor. The conductor freaked out and ran behind the engineer and just sort of sheltered there. They didn't know what to do. The engineer and the conductor didn't know what to do with the owl, but the owl eventually flew back out the side window. There are crows and vultures along the railroad, and they take care of any of the carcasses that wind up on the ground. Wild turkeys are along the railroad too, but off to the side. And when the train scared them, they would take flight, and they could fly like 40 miles an hour and match the speed of the engine easily, but only for short distances. At night, we would see opossums. They love to walk on the top of the rail, and they would walk toward the train or away from it, but they wouldn't get off that rail. I don't know whether the train ran over them or whether they got off the tracks at the last minute. I could never tell. On my last 3 years on the railroad, I ran in a part of New Jersey where we would encounter cows. The cows were being grass-fed on a pasture next to the tracks, and there was no fence. They were allowed to, the farmer allowed them to walk across the railroad back to the barn each night. Sometimes we would see there would be a couple, 2 or 3 of them standing on the tracks, and we could see them well in advance. They wouldn't pay attention to the horn, so we would have to come to a stop and get out on the front of the engine and yell at them, and they would look at us, and then eventually just slowly walk away toward the barn. There were foxes along the railroad, and they loved the railroad like the hawks did, looking for prey. And we would see them along the side or crossing in front of the train, but we never hit a fox. I mean, they always kept moving. Some of the strangest animals I ever saw were foxes with mange, where they had they lost clumps of their hair and off their body and their head, and they looked just, you couldn't even tell what type of a creature it was. Every once in a while, a dog would find its way onto the track. And dogs were a problem because when they would try to outrun the train, for some reason, they would start running away from the train, but they would not cross over the rail. So they would be between the rails on the tracks. And blowing the horn, ringing the bell, nothing would make them cross over that rail and get out of the way. The only thing that I found that would get them out of the way was lighting a fusee and throwing it out in front of the dog. That would get the dog to jump off the tracks. The fusee being a flare that the railroads use. One night, I was deadheading on the Bayonne Scoot, which operated between, where I rode it between Elizabeth, New Jersey, and Cranford, New Jersey. After my shift at Elizabeth. And I was riding on the head end with the engineer one night, and he came upon a dog, a German Shepherd, running between the rails, away from the train, and he slowed down. The dog would just kept running and running and running. It must have been 2 miles. The dog's tongue was hanging out almost to the ground, it seemed, and I lit a fusee, rolled the window down and threw it out in front of him, and that's what got him off the tracks. And then deer, of course. Deer were the animal that we hit the most with trains throughout New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And sometimes they would just jump out in front of the train, come out from out of nowhere, and there was no time to react, and we just hit them. And you could feel it when you hit a deer with the locomotive. You can feel it in the locomotive. And when at night the deer would get frozen by the headlight. The headlight kind of mesmerized them, and they would just freeze where they were. And if they were between the rails on the track, then it was good night nurse. I tried each time to dim the headlight, turn it off, toot the horn, ring the bell, but it seems like once they saw that headlight, that bright headlight, even when you turned it off, it still kept them frozen. It must have temporarily blinded them for a period of time. Yeah, they were a problem, but there was nothing we could do about it. And lastly, if you look closely at some bushes along a railroad, every once in a while you'd see a couple of animals that were actually railroad supervisors trying to catch crews violating rules. And they would hide in bushes and foliage. And there was always at least 2 of them because they needed a witness. And it just made life interesting. Take care and put some sand down.